What's up and welcome back to another live stream benchmarking. You get the raw data here with on-screen capture. We're going to be doing a 5-way benchmark comparison with the RTX 3070 versus the RTX 4050 and 4060 and two more 4060s, at least for a few of the benchmarks. And then we're going to move on to more specific benchmarks between the Zephyrus G16 and G15. The G15, of course, came out in 2021. This is the laptop I've got right here. This is a laptop that I know has been used almost every day now for a couple of years. So this will be a good, I guess, follow-up review because I did a detailed review on this previously as well. And so I just know that it's going to be very interesting because I think a lot of people right now are going to be struggling picking between RTX 3000 series and RTX 4000 series. And I'm hoping today's live stream will help just a lot of people figure out which one they want to buy. And it's going to be super interesting because I actually don't know which laptop is going to win in this benchmark battle because we have RTX 3070, which we're going to go over the specs all in the G15 here in a moment, and then all the specs in the G16 as well. But the 3070 has way more CUDA cores, but it's on an older architecture, and it also doesn't feature frame gen. And we're going to be doing tests with frame gen and without frame gen. I bought this originally for $17.99. All right, so it's an $1,800 laptop 2 years ago. Currently, you can buy this brand new on eBay for $14.99. It's one of the only places I saw selling it, but it was being sold by the official Best Buy account. So $14.99 is the current retail price of this RTX 3070 config with a really nice display, QHD display. So we've got a Ryzen 9 5900HS CPU in here. It's an 8-core, 13-thread part, okay? And it's not as high a wattage as what we're going to see in the Zephyrus G16. And the RTX 3070 has 8 gigs of VRAM, and it goes between 80 and 100 watts of GPU power. Now, the thing about the Zephyrus G15 is that it's got the Ryzen part, and the Zephyrus G16 has an Intel part. We're going to go over that in a second here. But the other big thing that's different besides the GPU is also the display. 2560 by 1440, 165 hertz, 318 nits, 93% Adobe RGB. Of course, this was my Spider 5 Elite, so it's basically underestimating, and it's very close to 100% Adobe RGB. Very awesome display in the Zephyrus G15. Not the super brightest display, but it's still very colorful, and it's a higher resolution display, 16 by 9 though. So that's kind of a downside. Now we have 16 gigs of DDR4 3200 megahertz RAM in both of the units, but the Zephyrus G15 has dual channel. Two 8 gig sticks with one of those 8 gig sticks soldered on, where the Zephyrus G16, you'll see in a second, is a single 16 gig stick soldered on single channel DDR4 3200. So it's the same speed of RAM, but one's dual channel, one is single channel. So that's another important spec difference between these two laptops. Now we've got a 1 terabyte PCIe SSD with an open M.2 slot, Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, and you do have upgraded Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2, I believe, on the Zephyrus G16, so you get slightly upgraded communication module, and they should be very similar in terms of weight, around 4.3 pounds and 0.78 inches thick. Now, the Zephyrus G16, all right, we got an i7-13620H for the processor. This is going to be a 10-core, 16-thread part. Popping back over to the specs, continuing the specs on the Zephyrus G16, $1449 for this laptop, okay? So it's going to be a lot cheaper, at least compared retail to retail price, but the thing is, the current price is actually only $50 difference between these two laptops, at least when buying them new. Now, the i7-13620H, 10-core, 16-thread part, 16 gigs DDR4 3200 megahertz single channel memory. One is soldered, and we have an empty SODIMM slot, so it's easy to upgrade that for dual channel memory. If you want to slap a second 16 gig stick, or 8 or 32 gig stick, if you want to go up to 48 total gigs of RAM. Now the RTX 4060 can go up to 100 to 120 with a boost, but we typically saw in the 90s for most of the games we played between like 90 to 95 watts, which is very similar to the Zephyrus G15 RTX 3070 wattage for most of the games. So we'll have to be paying attention to the wattage, but I think in the majority of titles, we're going to see very similar GPU wattage between the RTX 3070 and 4060 in these two laptops. Now, the Full HD 16:10, so Full HD plus 16:10 aspect ratio, 165 hertz display is 284 nits according to the Spider 5 and 94% sRGB. So it's a noticeably less colorful display than the G15 display, and it's lower resolution. But on this smaller display size, it's hard to see a visual difference between a QHD and Full HD display unless you tend to sit closer to your laptop. Now, we have a 512 gig SSD in the Zephyrus G16 with an open M.2 slot, HDMI 2.1, Thunderbolt 4, one USB-C, two USB-A 3.2s. So the nice thing about the Zephyrus G16 is that Thunderbolt 4 support. It gives you some more versatility on your ports. Then you got Ethernet, headphone, micro SD, 90-watt-hour battery. I don't think, is that actually accurate? I think that is accurate. Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.2, and then a 1080p webcam with Windows Hello. So that's another nice advantage for the Zephyrus G16. The webcam plus Windows Hello does give it more versatility for usability for like work or communication with your friends. Zephyrus G16 versus 15, key changes, similar chassis, keyboard, touchpad, and ports. Slight difference to the port, Thunderbolt 4 support versus only USB-C. 16:10 aspect ratio on the new G16. Brighter and more vibrant display on the G15 versus Full HD Plus on the G16. Now, the thing is, you can get the G16 with the higher QHD Plus display that's also even brighter and more vibrant than the G15, but you have to pay more money for it. So that's kind of an upgrade. I'm trying to do kind of a price versus price matching where you get an older GPU with a better display versus a new GPU and slightly worse display. There's a lot of trade-offs right now in the market, and this is a very good example of those kinds of trade-offs. Now, we should have slightly better thermals on the G16 with higher wattages to the CPU and GPU, and then we have Intel versus Ryzen CPUs, and then, of course, we have the huge difference of the Ada architecture on the RTX 4000 series that has 4 nanometers and the 8 nanometer architecture on the 3070. But both of these GPUs have 8 gigs of VRAM, so that's going to be very competitive. Frame generation on the RTX 4000 series is a huge advantage in single-player games, which we will see today. And then you pay $50 more for the RTX 3070 with a better display, at least currently at these prices right now. This 3070 may go on sale, go for even less than what the 4060 version is. It's going to go up and down. Prices, of course, are going to change. There are links in the description down below if you want to potentially pick one of these laptops up. So the G15 here, it's been used for a couple years now, and someone kindly let me borrow it for today's video, so shout out to Carla. All right, so we've got a ton of games installed. We're not going to do all of them. We're going to start off with Cinebench, then we're going to move into some game benchmarks. So Cinebench, we're going to do R23. Let's see what this Ryzen 9 5900HS can do. This is an 8-core, 16-thread part. I'm anticipating some good performance for a thin and light, but I think the G16 is going to actually win this CPU benchmark battle by a fair bit. This is the G15, right? Are you doing them one at a time? That is true. We could do this side by side. That is totally true. If we're going to do one, we might as well do them both at the same time. Beautiful. All right, so we're going to set it to manual fan mode with the highest possible performance settings, and just whatever the defaults are in manual fan mode. The manual fan mode will allow you to control the power limits, but the actual power limits you can set on the G15 versus G16 are quite a bit different now. All right, so and that's a platform difference between the two, and also that the Ryzen chip is actually going to be a little bit different in the sense that the way they calculate the wattage is different. So we're going to set all of our power limits up to the maximum. Here's the power limits on the G15. We're setting it to 45 and 80. We've raised the fan speed to 100%. The GPU we're going to set up to maximum as well. We're going to hit go. We're going to hit yes. All right. So there we are set up in the G15. All right, and then on the G16, you can see the power limits go all the way up to 110, 135, which is a much higher power limit, but it is Intel tracking the wattage versus AMD, and they don't necessarily measure the wattage exactly the same. So we've applied manual fan mode on this, so we can go ahead and close that down. And we'll open up Cinebench R23. Cool beans. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and just start a test and then pop over to here, and we're just gonna make sure that the CPU priority is set to above normal. So you can see that we have 6 P cores and 4 E cores on this CPU, which gives us 10 cores, 16 threads, versus on the, where is it? There it is, core clocks. On the Ryzen 9 5900HS, we have 8 cores, 16 threads. Okay, so we'll go ahead and reset that, and we'll reset this. We'll go ahead and start running Cinebench on both. And you can see that we're doing about 4 gigahertz on the Ryzen chip. Let's scoot this over just a little bit more. So on the left, we have the Zephyrus G15. On the right, we have the Zephyrus G16. There we go. All right, so our first score test, you can see the Ryzen got 12,940 versus 16,808. So let's go ahead and do 5 runs in a row, and we'll see. 13,000 versus 16.7. So we've established that at least in a single run test, we're getting about 3,800 more points on the Zephyrus G16, okay? So, and let's take a look at our temperatures. So we're hitting 96 degrees on the core temps on the G15, and we're hitting 96 degrees in the core temps for the package, at least, on the G16 as well. So they're both pushing maximum temperatures. We're doing 60 watts of CPU power on the G15 versus 95 watts on the G16. Let's do one more test on both of these. So we got 16.4 on the Zephyrus G16. And this test is just taking longer on the G15 because it's scoring less points, so it just takes longer, you know? So we got 12,730 for that round. So the scores go down a little bit as the laptop's thermal throttle. That is normal. And I did recently clean out the fans on the Zephyrus G15 today. At least I vacuum cleaned them. Not detail cleaning, but they should. I did do some game testing with the G15 a little bit earlier today, and we were still seeing good CPU, GPU temps in games, so I'm not too worried. We're going to go to a 10-minute test. So right now we're doing 3.54 gigahertz on the 8 cores in the Zephyrus G16. Our package power, wow, we've dropped our CPU package power now down to 45 watts of continuous power throughput, which is not nearly as high as what the Intel is doing. Let's take a look at what the Intel is doing. Our CPU package power on the Intel i7 is 102 watts, but it was doing 90, 96. We're averaging 99 watts of power to the G16, and the G15 is only averaging 50 watts of power. So almost literally double the power throughput in CPU-only performance testing. That's a huge difference, at least in terms of raw CPU throughput of electrical power. Now the Ryzen chip, this one's even still made on a smaller nanometer process than 2 years ago. AMD was still on a smaller nanometer process, so it's still going to be more power efficient on a per watt basis. So it's going to be more competitive than you would think, considering we're only doing 45 watts versus 100 watts of power. You know, look at our clock speeds. 3.54 on our clock speeds. Let's pop up to the clock speeds on the Zephyrus G16. There we go. So we're getting 4.1 gigahertz on 4.18 gigahertz. We've averaged 4.2 gigahertz on the P cores and 3.3 gigahertz on the E cores. So on a fundamental level, when you decide between these two laptops, you really got to think about like the technological advances that we've had in our cooling systems, allowing for CPUs to push higher wattage of performance. Now, again, it's not apples to apples because this is a AMD CPU versus an Intel CPU. What I think really matters is the final numbers here a lot more. If like the Zephyrus G16 is still like 11, 12,000, and then the G16 I'm guessing is going to be around 15, 16,000, then you know the Zephyrus G16 has a clear advantage, but it's not as big of an advantage as what the raw specs look like, and that's simply because AMD jumped the gun a couple years and is running their CPUs at a more efficient process. So now let's take a look at our average temperatures. We're in the final run. The Zephyrus G15 did 84 degrees and 46 watts on average. Let's just see the clock speeds. Clock speeds at 3.54. All right, so the Zephyrus G16 averaged 4.19 on the P cores, 3.3 on the E cores. Our core temps were 88 degrees with the core CPU, with the CPU package doing, I believe, 94 degrees. All right, and then our package power still doing 100 watts, but it averaged 95 because it has some lulls in between. Let's go ahead and see what our final scores are. We got 11,829 over here on the Zephyrus G15. And then now we're going to see what we get on the Zephyrus G16 here in a moment. Shaboom, we got 15,988. All right, that's excellent. That does show you that you're getting, you know, about a 33% performance gain overall on the CPU, like 33% faster, at least in multi-core workloads. And this may translate into some gaming performance as well. But the Ryzen chip is also a pretty good CPU for gaming too. So, you know, we'll have to actually see what we get in the end. In the top left, we have the Acer Nitro 5 that costs $1,000. It's got an RTX 4050. It had a 105 watt, even though it says 90 watt. We weren't sure what it was. We have the MSI Cyborg 45 watt with RTX 4060. Then the Gigabyte G5 RTX 4060 at 75 watt in the bottom middle. And then we have the Zephyrus G16 up to 120 watt, but typically is 105 watts is the maximum I ever see on the Zephyrus G16. So it's going to be a 5-way comparison today. This is interesting. This is a real challenge to do. All right, so looking at the G15, let's focus on that for a moment, and then we'll compare. So right now we're doing about 66 FPS walking down this hallway. Our GPU temperature at 62 degrees is still excellent. The Asus CPU paste, I believe, does this have liquid metal on it? I can't remember if it did. But either way, the CPU paste is still holding up really well with both the CPU and GPU temps in the 60s there. The 3080 here, I got to change this. This is not 105 watt. This is 100 watt. So this is super interesting. You can see the Zephyrus G16 and G15 are doing very similar FPS through these same areas, going up the shaft there, doing 50 something, mid 50s. Wow, it's so similar. 65 as we go over the top, 65 as we go over the top for the Zephyrus G16. The performance is so similar between the Zephyrus G16 and the Zephyrus G15 this year. It's incredible, actually, how close neck and neck it is in terms of Timespy performance levels. I think the Zephyrus G16 might just be a little bit ahead right now, but it's not far off, and the temperatures are actually pretty similar. Notice that the Zephyrus G16 doing 105 watts most of the time, but it's occasionally jumping up to 110 or 115 watts. And I only saw 120 watts for like a split second during the whole Timespy. A 2-year-old laptop holding up. That's good. Yeah, that is good. Looks like the CPU test is not going to be quite as high because we're only doing 35, 28, 29 FPS. It's only a few FPS behind, but it's not a huge difference. The 4060 is going to win. Yes, it does. So we got 9,416 on the Zephyrus G15. 8,572 on the CPU score. So the Zephyrus G16 got 10,520, 9,482. So a slight advantage, about a 10% advantage on both the CPU and GPU, at least in Timespy, for the Zephyrus G16. Now, we're going to find out how that translates going into other benchmarks, into all these different games now. So that's going to be, we're going to continue to see some, I think, interesting results, okay? This one's going to be very interesting because all of the other laptops right now have frame gen enabled, and I'm not going to be able to turn frame generation on with the RTX 3070. So we're going to be seeing the performance of frame gen on the other laptops versus no frame gen on this laptop. Now, I will be able to do non-frame gen tests as well between these two laptops, but in terms of what frame gen versus no frame gen on some of these tests, I can't turn off frame gen because these tests were done in the past on these other laptops, right? So I've got to test what I've got, how I've got, and we do have some non-frame gen tests that we'll be comparing against all 5 of these laptops. So we're going to be testing this at the same resolution, which is going to be 1080p for this test, which is going to be matching the exact same resolution as these other 5 laptops. We're going to do ray tracing on Ultra with DLSS on Quality. Okay, so here we are, no frame gen on the Zephyrus G15 versus frame generation on all the other laptops. So you can see we're getting 43 FPS on average with 32 for our 1% lows. Yeah. Wow. That's a huge difference in performance using frame gen to boost the smoothness of the gameplay. Like I said, though, that is with frame generation enabled, but that's really what's going to be, that's what it's going to be like, right? When you buy a 3000 series versus 4000 series, you're deciding not to get a laptop with frame generation. So it's important to understand the differences, because certain games like Cyberpunk 2077 that support frame gen are going to have massive performance differences in terms of smoothness and overall performance, right? So you can see that on the 3070 100 watt got 47.6, so basically 48 FPS here, with 28 for our 1% or our min FPS, right? So that's going to be pretty good in terms of playability. You're actually going to be able to play on these settings on the RTX 3070. You could obviously turn these settings way down. We're on RTX Ultra right now, right? You do not have to play the game on ray tracing on Ultra and all Ultra settings, you know. So you could totally still get much more playable frame rates on this 3070 than what we're seeing here. But you can see that on the Zephyrus G16, we got 102 FPS. And then the Gigabyte G5, we got 91 FPS. And the Cyborg, and then the Nitro 5 got 79. If you are playing a frame generation enabled game, that's going to be the performance difference. Again, that's not going to be the same for every single one. And we're going to be doing some side-by-sides without frame gen as well. So just reminding everyone. And we're about to do one without frame gen. Dead Space, a very CPU demanding game, sometimes can be CPU bottlenecked depending on how powerful the GPU is. So we're just going to get everything set up here. We're going to set everything to ultra settings with DLSS on quality. All right, so that means no ray tracing. There's just everything else is pretty much standard stock. All right, so we're going to go ahead and play our benchmark, and we've reset our own benchmark numbers. So we are live with our benchmark now with Dead Space. Let's examine our FPS numbers, okay? All right, so starting in the top left, Acer Nitro 5 getting 85, 84 FPS. And that is phenomenal for $1,000. Really, really great performance. The Cyborg 15 with an RTX 4060 45 watt. That thing is kind of struggling a little bit. You can see that it's, you know, you're doing you're losing a bit of performance if you go with the Cyborg, because it's only 45 watts on that 4060 and it's only doing 67 FPS. The Gigabyte G5 also not that powerful in a dual load game like this, only doing 68 FPS. So the 3070 handily beats the RTX 4060 and 40 in both the Cyborg 15 and the Gigabyte G5, because this is a very CPU bound game. Or a CPU needs a good blend of CPU and GPU power to push higher frame rates, right? And the Zephyrus G16 is doing the highest TDP between both of these laptops, and you can see that it is killing it right now at 86 FPS, which is right now about 6 more FPS than the RTX 3070 variant. So, you know, if you're talking, you know, if you're wanting to get something that is a high amount of power, a high amount of throughput in a reasonable price package, the G16 is a pretty good option, but the Zephyrus G15 also still is a very good option if you're looking for something with a higher quality display, right? Because this has a QHD 165 hertz display, which is a huge, massive difference. Let me go ahead and just back up the video here just a little bit, and let's take a look at our final numbers. And I gotta say, our temperatures on the CPU right now are pretty spicy on this Ryzen 9 5900 at 97 degrees. And looking at our wattage throughputs, you can see that we're doing 80 watts to the GPU, 36 watts to the CPU. And essentially, the way I see it going down right now is we are being CPU bound mainly, but if we had more CPU juice going through this laptop, we would be able to push some higher FPS probably with this 3070. So I think a higher wattage 3070 with a higher wattage CPU combo could definitely probably beat the Zephyrus G16. So it's important to keep that in mind. All right. 79 FPS overall though it's quite good. That's quite good in my opinion. All right, so we're on ultra settings. Our display is at 1080p, 16:9, DLSS on quality. Let's take a look at our performance right now. We're doing 54 FPS on the Zephyrus G15 with an RTX 3070. Notice our wattage pull is about 8890 right now in this very GPU-bound game with a 99% GPU utilization. So we're really utilizing that RTX 3070 in this test. We are about 10 FPS behind the RTX 4060 120 watt. We are beating, though, 2 of the RTX 4060s. So looking at our numbers, we're beating the Gigabyte G5 by 6 FPS by about 10%. The Cyborg we're beating by about 12 FPS. So again, power limits matter a lot still with RTX 4000 series. RTX 4050, though, we're basically matching. The 3070 in this is basically matching the RTX 4050 frame for frame right now in this raw rasterization test, which is super interesting because this is a very GPU bound game. And I was not quite expecting that. I was actually expecting the 3070 to handily beat the 4050, but it's not in this game. So that's very interesting to see. Basically identical performance between the 3070 and the 4050. The 4060 is handily beating the 3070 by about 8 FPS or about 14%, 15%. DLSS on quality, no frame generation, uncapped FPS. Everything is on ultra with low textures, with ray tracing enabled. One thing to point out is that if you only have 6, right now we're in Hogwarts. Let's just run around in Hogwarts for a moment and see what kind of FPS we're getting. It appears to be pretty playable, but a lot of stutters. Wow, okay, no, down to 25 FPS there. You know, we're fully utilizing all of our RAM. We are wanting, the game is wanting to use probably around 24, 25 gigs of RAM right now. So having 16 gigs of RAM is going to be a limitation on all of the laptops that we're testing. And you got to keep in mind, some of these laptops only had 8 gigs of RAM that we were testing, okay? So right now we're doing around 132 FPS, and it's not very smooth either. Our 1% lows are pretty severe. Let's see what we're getting. All right, so right now we're getting 42, 43 FPS on the 3070. Again, frame generation is enabled on these other laptops where it's not enabled on the 3070. So that's the main difference here. We will do a test with frame generation disabled. But notice how even the 4060 at 45 watts can obliterate a 3070. All right, it's literally obliterating it, in my opinion. In terms of playable frame rates, I would say that a 3070 is going to perform worse than a 4060 in a game like Hogwarts when frame generation is taken into account. If you're not going to take frame generation into account, you're not going to play frame generation games. Let's say you're mainly an esports player, then this benchmark completely does not matter, right? You don't have to worry about frame generation. Don't feel any pressure from the frame generation. But if you mainly play single player games, I think frame generation will be in almost, not all, but the vast majority of new titles in, say, 2024, 2025, in those years. And you're probably planning on keeping a laptop at least for that long, right? So frame generation is not something I think you should ignore if you're a single player gamer mainly. So right now we're doing 42 FPS with a 3070. That's barely playable, 31 per our 1% lows. The G16 though, doing 90 FPS, 73 for our 1% lows. Gigabyte G5 doing 73 FPS, 48 for our 1% lows. The Cyborg doing 60 FPS, 40 for our 1% lows. And the Acer Nitro 5 at $1,000 with a 4050 is doing 75 FPS with 37 for our 1% lows. So massive difference there between performance on the 3000 versus 4000 series in a frame generation game. We are ready to do our side-by-side with the 3060 with no frame generation. Though 4060 versus 3070. With no frame generation, let's go ahead and let me get that loaded up. Our FPS averages, now that we're situated in the same spot, we are doing 42 FPS on the G15, and whoa, we went up a little bit. You know, and the tricky part is we're not loaded into the exact same scene with the exact same time. So looking at our temperatures, the Intel CPU right now doing a lot more FPS, and we're doing 47 on average right here versus 37 on average. So about 10 FPS more in this raw rasterization test. Let's also go ahead and do a quick verification of our settings. We're on all ultra settings with everything enabled except textures on low. Everything's on maximum settings, textures on low, no frame generation enabled. But right now, 46 FPS on the 4060, 38 on the 3070. That's really not an ideal playable range on either laptop, in my opinion. I would definitely want more. So in this scenario, I'd probably try setting the settings down to low maybe, or maybe dropping DLSS maybe down to balanced. All right, and then inside the settings, let's just go to a custom preset. Let's go medium settings. All right, we'll apply that and we'll apply that. Okay, so we're on both on medium settings now, and we are still not doing that great on the FPS. The 4060 did jump up higher at 48 FPS versus 40 right now. You can't really see the FPS numbers very well. A little bit better, but right now about 10 more FPS on the 4060. And I think this is because we have ray tracing enabled, and the 4060 is just better at calculating those traces of ray, or the lighting, basically, the light rays. So, because I believe they have better dedicated ray tracing performance, like processors inside the GPU. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're wanting to play with ray tracing enabled, then the performance gap may be pretty large for that reason. Let's try no ray tracing and see if the 3070 can come back and get a win with no ray tracing enabled. All right, so no ray tracing enabled now. Looking at our performance, no ray tracing. Wow, we're still winning on the Zephyrus G16. This is a very CPU bound area. I think the CPU performance difference here is going to be very noticeable. But that's a natural part of this test because you're buying a older gen tech with older gen CPU versus a newer gen GPU with a newer gen CPU, and it's part of the package deal, you know. We're gonna try to run. I can't turn the mouse character, but we can go through this area and see our performance difference as we're running. Interesting, the 3070 is doing pretty good right now. It's actually competing really well with better 1% lows. I'm gonna go and reposition to face forward. Those 1% lows are very important. Okay, so there's our performance difference right there. We got 68 FPS running through Hogsmeade with 15 for our 1% lows, which is pretty dang low. And then we got 34 for our 1% lows on the Zephyrus G16. That's much better. 68 FPS. I would rather have this type of performance if I was playing the game. That said, let's continue running and seeing what we get. We'll start a new batch, and we'll continue running. And I'm gonna try to make this as fair as I can as we run around the map here. Of course, it's not going to be completely perfect, but at least we'll be in the same area of the game. So again, higher FPS on the 4060, and you know, our 1% lows may be inherent to the CPU differences too. The Ryzen CPUs in previous tests had better 1% low performance than the Intel, at least in Hogwarts, in my other CPU tests that I did. All right. So our 1% lows are getting a bit better now that we're in an area with a lot less NPCs. I'm going to refresh our number. We basically have similar types of performance on both, but our 1% lows are better. Oh, I can't leave out here. We got to go this way, I guess. We go back towards the city. There we go. Our 1% lows are a lot better outside of Hogsmeade without all the NPCs and extra animations. Super interesting. So definitely the 4060 is pushing higher frames with ray tracing enabled, ray tracing disabled, and obviously with frame generation enabled, much better frames on the 4060. Okay, so we need to make sure we're at 1080p, no frame cap. We cannot turn frame generation on, right? So that's important to recognize that we cannot turn frame generation on. We want everything on low to start with DLSS on quality. So we're on the low preset, DLSS on quality. And we're at, for display, we're at 1080p 16:9 for this test. We are gonna be frame generation enabled on the other laptops. We cannot enable frame generation on the 3070, right? So that's another key difference. Very smooth frame rate so far. Let's go ahead and get set up in the same area. We're getting 118 FPS on average. The RTX 4050 getting 158. The 4060 low watt Cyborg 124. The Gigabyte G5 4060 75 watt 144. Again, keep in mind, frame generation enabled on the 4000 series, no frame gen on the 3000 series. 182 on the Zephyrus G16. Very interesting result. We can do a non-frame gen test on this as well. I'm going to get the Witcher 3 loaded up on the G16, but we're going to keep doing this test. So we're going to switch everything over to high settings now. So again, the 3070 is way behind when factoring in frame gen, but of course that's frame gen. Our settings for this test, next test, is going to be ray tracing on ultra. Again, no frame gen, but we'll do a frame gen. We'll do a non-frame gen test as well. Everything is on ray tracing ultra now. Display 1080p 16:9 still. So now we're doing 40 FPS versus 60 on the Nitro, 53 on the Cyborg, 59 on the G5, and 77 on the G16. So a 37 FPS gain on the G16 with the frame generation enabled. Wow. That is a huge difference when you turn frame gen on, and it really is a difference in smoothness of gameplay on the same settings, right? Notice our wattage pull. We're doing the same wattage on the RTX 3070 100 watts right here versus 15 watts to the CPU. Wow, the CPU is hardly taking any wattage in this scenario. On the Ryzen, very interesting. All right, so let's go ahead and do a side-by-side now. There's the ultra settings for you. So we got 60 on the Nitro, 52 on the Cyborg, 59 on the Gigabyte G5, 77 on the Zephyrus G16 versus the 3940 FPS of the G15. The G15 is still going to be playable, but it's far from ideal. You know, you really want to get closer to the 60 plus FPS range, which all these other laptops are getting really close to, if not surpassing, right? So that is a huge difference in performance between the 3070 without frame gen versus these other laptops with frame gen. So next, we have a test to see what kind of performance you get without frame gen on both laptops. So we're about to do the split screen test again. So we're going to do ray tracing on ultra, DLSS on quality, 1080p, no frame generation. So we're disabling frame gen. All the settings should be the same except no frame generation, which, you know, if you're doing a side-by-side test in a game like this, you'd obviously be running frame gen, but this is going to help you get a better idea of our performance numbers. So 44 FPS versus about 40 FPS. Our 1% lows are basically the same. Our 4060 is only pulling 80 watts in this scenario versus 100 watts on the 3070, because the Ryzen CPU is, I guess, more power efficient in this scenario, because the Intel is pulling 44 watts versus the Ryzen's pulling 15 watts. Very interesting performance difference there, allowing the GPU to boost higher with the Ryzen chip. Our actual temperatures on the GPU is 69 degrees on the G16 though, 68 degrees here versus 77 for the G15. And then our CPU temps are 80 on the Ryzen and 77 for the Intel. So the Intel's doing a good job cooling itself down, or the Zephyrus is cooling it down really well, even though it's pushing much higher wattage through the CPU. Super interesting. Let's try doing a bit of a run test. Let me try all low settings though as well. You know, in a game like this, though, because we're pulling higher wattage through the GPU on the 3070, it's not exactly an apples-to-apples fair comparison, but it is a platform-to-platform difference because the Ryzen is just more power efficient, allowing the GPU to boost a little higher. So I think that's a very important context to keep in mind for this laptop test right now. So I'm going to try to find kind of just I don't know, an area we can run around to. I kind of want to also try this without any ray tracing. All right, so I want to try this on a more realistic frame rate, low settings again. Or let's just try ultra with no ray tracing, because that's probably what a lot of people would want to do. Ultra with no ray tracing should be also very realistic, because then you get high textures, but you don't have the ray tracing, maybe potential advantage for the 4060. All right, so here's some nice FPS numbers for us. So 101. 102. Wow, it's so close in this scenario. Our 1% lows are still better on Ryzen, and we're pulling way less wattage to the CPU on Ryzen too. Right now, it's saying we're passing the VRAM on high settings. On medium settings, it says we're going to be good on VRAM usage. So we'll probably test on medium settings. I feel bad doing medium settings, but that's the realistic nature. I mean, we could try ultra settings to start with. It wants 11 gigs of VRAM right here. That's what it's saying, 11 gigs of VRAM for the ultra settings on Last of Us at 1080p or 1200p. If we were to do ultra settings, and we could just turn textures down probably. We're setting textures to medium, and then ultra settings, except for textures, is what we're gonna have to do in this game. All right, so options, graphics. We're gonna do ultra settings and scroll down. Both of these laptops only having 8 gigs of VRAM. This is the realistic reality of an 8 gig VRAM laptop in 2023, and it's only going to get worse as the years go on. Here we are, Last of Us benchmark, RTX 3070 versus RTX 4060. Let's see what we get. Notice that we're maxing the RAM on both of these systems, 16 gigs being maxed. And again, we've got to remember that we have single channel RAM on one laptop and dual channel on the other laptop. Wow, the FPS is so similar. 61 FPS average on both machines. Intel with a higher 1% lows for the first time today. Our CPU temps are better on the Ryzen this round. Way less wattage going through the Ryzen. 50, 30, 40 less watts going through the Ryzen chip. But Intel with slightly better performance, at least in 1% lows. Notice that our 3070 is able to boost higher at 93 watts of power. That's a pretty big difference, right? Being able to boost your GPU wattage to a higher level. It's going to make a big difference. Our memory utilization on the 4060 is a bit higher at 7.1 gigs versus the 3070 doing 6.6 gigs, which is interesting. It makes me question if I have the exact same settings being ran, but as far as I know, they are. I just refreshed the benchmark counter again. So our average is actually going up a little bit. It's interesting. So the 4060, even though it's at less wattage right now, even though the 4060 is at less wattage, we're still pushing a higher frame rate on the 4060 at like 15 or so less watts to the GPU, which I was not expecting that. So again, about 4 more FPS on the 4060 than the 3070. Very interesting result. I was not expecting it to be so close, honestly. I mean, I knew they would be kind of close, but it's very, very close. All right, so now we're in the game. I could actually move around a little bit. We'll start off with frame gen enabled on the 4060, like the way that, you know, a typical player is going to actually run the game and play the game, and then we'll do no frame gen. All right, so high quality ray tracing, full screen. Frame generation is enabled. DLSS is on quality. So yeah, frame generation really pushing much higher frames so far in this game. 87 on the Zephyrus G16 with a 4060, 55 FPS for the 3070. Obviously extremely playable on both systems with and without frame gen. We're going to do a non-frame gen test here in a moment, but this is just to give you a good idea of the kind of performance difference you can expect with the way each of these laptops are designed to be ran, right? My OS 17X 4090 crashes after 10 minutes every time I boot it up. Interesting, Masses. Why would it test 10 minutes? Is that with or without a load? I'm curious. Samuel says, should I push my 1.1K budget for a G5 to the 1.5K for the Zephyrus, or downgrade and go for a good 4050? I do think that it's better to get a 4060 with 8 gigs of VRAM for 1080p gaming. The 8 gigs of VRAM will be noticeable and worthwhile upgrade that you'll see the benefits of as the years go on more and more. So I would recommend a 4060 over a 4050 if you have the money. If you're on a tight locked budget, it's not like it would be terrible on either one though. Okay, so we ended up with 91 FPS and 59 FPS. So we got about a 50% performance gain on the RTX 30 versus the RTX 3070, the 4060 being about 50% faster. Now, let's go ahead and do a non-frame generation test with the exact same settings. Looks like we're actually getting fair benchmark numbers for once. This is good. This is very good. All right. So right now we're doing about three or so more FPS than the RTX 3070. The 4060 slightly outperforming right now, but we'll see as we go along here. For $1,500, Massa says he'd get a secondhand Legion 7 last gen. That's another great option. Like I'm selling my RTX 3080, Scar 15, and Legion 7i 3080, and both of those are very high-end machines with great displays. So, does frame generation have noticeable quality difference based on my tests? I cannot tell that frame generation is enabled visually, except that it's a smoother experience. For the most part, there's a few things in certain games that you're going to be able to tell, like the HUD elements, or maybe certain fabric, maybe that don't auto-generate as well with the AI frames. But and then the other thing with the visual experience is that it slightly increases latency. So, but in a single-player game, I would take the increased smoothness, because it's like a huge gain in smoothness with frame gen, with the slight increase to latency. You know, it might be like 20% worse latency, but in a single-player game, that doesn't matter, right? So we ended up with 60 FPS over here on our average, and I accidentally pressed the wrong button. Looks like it was 59 FPS right as it ended. So we ended up with essentially the same performance. Right as we ended, 60 FPS. So 60 FPS in both the RTX 3070 and 4060. Basically identical performance on both of these machines. Pretty insane. All right, so right now we are doing 1080p full screen, DLSS checked on both. For our quality preset, we're going to do high on both, and we're going to do ray tracing on high on both. So basically maximum settings 1080p. I think we're going to do 1200p for our resolution. All right, 16 by 10. Okay, so right now we are doing 77 FPS on the 3070, 82 FPS on the 4060. So higher FPS once again on the 4060, and the Ryzen chip is just sipping the wattage at 16 watts, 56 watts right now, 44 watts on that i7 Intel chip. The Intel chip is just taking way more juice to run some of these games. And looking at our GPU temps, we're at 68 degrees on the 4060, 70 degrees on the 3070, and we're at 100% GPU utilization on both of the systems right now. So that's all very good, and our temps on both systems are very good overall. They're very similar temps, GPU utilization, really showing that it's such a similar platform and performance level in raw rasterization performance between these two systems. Hey, I'm doing a good job, right? Running two games at once. It's so hard to do. I'm just controlling with gamepad too, touchpad. So the 4060 right now is really, it's beating the 3070 in this test. 77 FPS and 83 FPS, at least in this raw rasterization test. even though the 3070 right now has higher levels of wattage. So 98 watts going through the 3070, only 80 watts going through the 4060, and the 4060 is still winning, interestingly enough. Okay, so I think we're good to go. We have highest settings on both systems, ray tracing enabled, and I believe DLSS is on quality, yes. DLSS on quality, ray tracing enabled, ultra settings. We're at 1920 by 1200 resolution. It's unfortunate that our laptop on the right, the G16, loaded quite a bit faster. Whoa, this is a big performance difference, at least initially. Interesting. Okay, so we're rounding out now to about a 15 FPS gain on the 4060. I was not anticipating that we would have that big of an FPS gain on the 4060 in this test. Pretty interesting. Yeah, the Strix. I think the Strix G16 is also a really good option at under $1,500, but it just doesn't have a QHD display. It's just full HD. That's the main downside to it. But it's still a really good option. Yeah, the 4060 is winning big in this test, which I was not anticipating. I thought that I would think that this one would actually do pretty well with the 3070. You know, the 3070 in almost all of these games has been doing 100 watts versus only about 80 watts on the Strix G16 4060. And yet the 4060 is still winning almost all of the raw rasterization tests. Suji says, would you recommend an Alienware M16 for the price range of $2,500? Well, the M16 costs $2,600, and it does come with some nice premium features over the Strix G18, like advanced Optim. Sorry, they both have advanced Optimus, but the Alienware has Windows Hello, but it doesn't have as bright of a display. And the bad thing about the M16 is that the software is terrible. At least so far, I have yet to see it be better on the control software. It just doesn't work very well. It's hard to update. It's hard to control your stuff, like your fan profiles and everything. So in general, I would only recommend the Alienware M16 if you're willing to deal with software jankiness. Poison Milk Bob says, how is this generation's Lenovo Legion Pro 5i, or should I wait for the AMD version to release? I have not tested the Legion Pro 5i. It's going to be on the to-do list to test for later this year. So we'll have to see how it does. But I anticipate it's going to be good. It's going to be a good laptop. I'm not thinking it's going to be bad or anything. Benson says, so if you want 4K gaming, would you suggest a 4090 laptop, or should I go for a SFF PC? I'm guessing you mean self-building the PC. I'm going to scoot the camera over a little bit. You can see we got 97 FPS on the 4060, 85 FPS on the 3070 Ti. Very good performance on the 4060. That is the biggest gap we have seen so far for a non-frame generation game. That is, of course, about a 14% performance gap. So there's an advantage to the 4060 in this game, even though it was running at 80 watts versus 100 watts on the 3070. Kaboom. All right. So in terms of raw rasterization performance and frame generation being taken into account, which of these two laptops, if you have $1,500, would I recommend? Okay. Oh, and you can extrapolate this out to the other laptops in the market segment. But you got to keep in mind, there's a lot of variations between the different laptops, right? So it's not going to be a perfect one-to-one apples comparison, all right? The key thing to keep in mind when evaluating these benchmarks is that both of these GPUs in these laptops are in like the 80 to 100 watt range in most of the games that they're playing. If you have a higher TDP laptop, then I think a 3070 is going to perform a bit better when you can go up to like 130 watts of power versus an RTX 4060 going up to like say 140 watts of power. The 3070 is going to get a little bit more of an edge from that increased power limit. So if you're dealing with a laptop, like if you're going to buy a thicker laptop, then just know that the 3070 is probably going to get a little bit more boost from the extra juice. I'm guessing about a 5% performance boost, which would bring it a little bit more in line with the performance we saw from the 4060. Now, in most of the games we tested today, in the frame generation enabled games, we saw anywhere from 50 to 100% performance gains on the 4060 with frame generation enabled. Now, when we turned off frame generation, we saw the 4060 beat the 3070 in every single game we tested, without exception, except a couple of the games we tied, where it was within like 1 or 2 FPS of the laptops being together. So Dying Light 2 was basically a tie right at 60 FPS, like 59, 60. And what other game was a tie? I think there was like The Witcher 3 was almost exactly the same as well. So, you know, your performance in non-frame generation games will basically be almost identical. You have the same VRAM between these two, and yeah, so it's going to be so similar between a 3070 and a 4060. Now, of course, the biggest difference between these laptops, realistically, is that the display is better quality on the 3070 variant because it's a QHD display and it's a higher color gamut display and it's slightly brighter as well. So if you're after a laptop that is brighter and has more color gamut, then sacrificing the GPU for a better display is, I think, a viable option, especially if you mainly play multiplayer games. Now, if you mainly play single player games, then going with the 4060 option is, I think, the no-brainer. Like, if you mainly play single player games, I think there will be more and more games where frame generation is going to be enabled, and you're going to have 50 to 100% more FPS in those frame generation games as the years go on. And that is not going to change. Like, this laptop, as far as I know, it's not going to change. Maybe NVIDIA is going to come out of nowhere and they're going to be like, oh, frame generation can now be used on all NVIDIA GPUs. Though, to the best of my knowledge, it's something that is specific to the hardware in the RTX 4000 series, as that's what NVIDIA claims, and I don't have the technical knowledge, and so far, we have not seen anyone break open the BIOS and allow it to be enabled on RTX 3000 series. There was a rumor that you could, but it was never verified and proven that you could use frame generation on older generation GPUs. Now, there are other differences between these laptops that you've got to keep in mind as well, okay? We did not get to test Warzone 2. I wanted to test it today. I installed it on both laptops, but unfortunately, you have to have a mobile number, so I wasn't able to test it. But basically, in games like Warzone 2, where they're very CPU limited and CPU bound, you're going to get a lot more performance on the newer CPUs because CPU bound games, they're just going to get big gains with the new CPUs compared to the older CPUs, like in this 2021 Zephyrus laptop, right? So you might, I'm guessing, if I were to guess, you're probably going to get a big difference in performance with the RTX 4060 with the i7 CPU. Now, I haven't actually done the test, but that's my current prediction. So just know that there are other advantages and design differences besides just the raw GPU performance and the display, because a lot of the newer laptops this year almost all have Windows Hello, not all of them, but most of them have Windows Hello and 16:10 aspect ratio displays as well. So if you do decide to go with a new 4060 laptop, you may get some design upgrades and feature upgrades, like the webcam. Like this Zephyrus G15, it's a nice gaming laptop. It'll play just about any game on the market on ultra settings at QHD resolution, right? Like it's a very good laptop. But certain games you are going to have to turn the settings down, including the textures, especially if you don't want it to stutter, like in games like Hogwarts. But the big but there is that you don't have the webcam, you don't have 16:10 aspect ratio, and you don't have frame generation. And this laptop, the new version of the Zephyrus G16, it has all of those things, and therefore it's, to me, more recommendable to more people. Because especially at this 15 or 16 inch display size, the increased resolution from Full HD to QHD is not going to be quite as noticeable as it is on larger screen devices. Like when the laptops go up to 18 inches, it becomes a bigger deal, I think, going to the QHD resolution, because you're going to be able to visually see that difference and finer detail just sitting at your regular viewing distance. Now, if you're someone who sits close to your laptop display, then you can still see the difference even at a 16-inch resolution. Or if you have just really good eyesight, maybe you'll be able to see the difference. But in moving gameplay images, it's extremely difficult to spot the difference in your typical gameplay, jumping from 1080p up to QHD at a 15-inch chassis size. So in general, which of these two laptops would I recommend? I would definitely recommend the Zephyrus G16 for most people, for more future proofing, because of the webcam, because of Windows Hello. There's just a lot of advantages there. Now, with the older Ryzen chip, you're going to get better battery life actually on this older laptop, which is a bit weird to say. So if you're looking for better battery life, I think the older one would actually give you a little bit better juice for longevity. Steve says, who thought no webcam was a good idea? Yeah, that is totally true. What the heck was Asus thinking when they took the webcam off of these laptops in 2021? It was a bad decision. Yeah, so there's my comparison between RTX 3070 Zephyrus G15 versus the Zephyrus G16 with the RTX 4080. If it was my money, I would buy the new G16 with the 4060. I meant 4060, not 4080 a second ago. Because of the frame generation and because of the webcam, Windows Hello, and 16:10 aspect ratio of the display. I think all of those things give it the advantage, the edge that it needs to be a better buy. Plus, Thunderbolt 4 support for ports is also a noticeable difference if you're wanting to do an eGPU down the line or use Thunderbolt 4 connectors. Those also can make a difference. There's the live stream, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one.